Hello again. Today I'm going to share with you a little bit more about my third book, Ticker Tape. This again is about the Vietnam veteran. He's a bit washed up. His name is Marvin Wineski. This book is divided down chapter-wise as to the different characters. So it kind of goes back and forth between Marvin and then Bess, who was his ex-wife, and then later on a few other characters. But the very first chapter is Marvin, New York City, Ticker Tape Parade, May 8th, 1985. And as I may have mentioned before, I got the whole idea for this book from the very first sentence, and then I envisioned a veteran in a ticker tape parade and kind of went from there. So on May 8th, 1985, there was a ticker tape parade in New York City for the Vietnam veterans. And I decided to, run with that and make my veteran that I had in my mind a Vietnam vet. And thus was born Marvin Wineski. So I will read the first chapter. It's a little bit long, but I hope you stick with me. And then I really hope that you get yourself a copy of Ticker Tape. Remember, my books can be bought as paperback or ebooks through Amazon. So here's the first chapter. Confetti rained down upon him. It came to rest on his shoulders. It trickled off the brim of his faded and dilapidated camouflage jungle hat. It got into his eyes and mouth whenever he craned his neck to peer up at the people waving from the windows along Broadway Avenue. And it flowed in a river of white from his crotch down the crevice between his long, useless legs until it tumbled like a waterfall off his lap and onto his shoes. Marvin Wineski considered his shoes for a moment. He knew he was wearing them, even though he really couldn't see them, perched where they were on the feet holders of his wheelchair. He imagined that they were gleaming in the New York City May sunshine because he'd personally taken them from the shoebox where they'd nestled unused for the past 20 years, and he'd carefully polished and buffed them to a shine they hadn't seen since they were brand new and worn that first time on his wedding day. They'd once sort of pinched his toes. He'd give anything to feel that pinch again. Shifting his thoughts from his shoes to the passing scene, he found himself marveling at the distance he'd come in those years since he'd been a naive young man on the cusp of adulthood. That young man had marched into Griffith's Shoe Emporium in downtown Boise to buy himself a pair of fancy dress shoes for his wedding. Now, he was a wreck of a man, a bent, paralyzed shell of his former self. Marvin shook his head slightly. He still wasn't sure how he'd let himself be talked into coming to New York for this parade, the biggest ticker tape parade the city had ever seen. Why now, he wanted to know. Why did the country seem to care about him and his war buddies now, 10 years after the war had ended? They sure hadn't given a damn about him 12 years ago when he'd returned broken and in need of compassion. Where was his parade back then? His eyes lit on a boy standing in front of a woman who had tears streaming down her cheeks as she watched the men pass by. The boy looked to be about 9 or 10, Marvin guessed, and he was gawking at the veterans with a mixture of awe and fear. Marvin noticed that the woman was clutching a framed photograph of a young man wearing army fatigues. He sighed. Another casualty of a war that saw thousands upon thousands of people die. Was this boy that man's son? Marvin considered the possibility, but he doubted it was the case. The boy was too young, unless the army man had been amidst the final fatalities. More likely, the boy was the woman's son from a second marriage or from an affair meant to soothe some of the pain she'd experienced at losing her young husband to the jungles of Vietnam. Those thoughts, and many others, came to Marvin in the short span of the few seconds worth of connection he had with the unknown boy and his mother, and he shook his head to dispel them. That's why he preferred not to make eye contact or even to look at the faces of the people he passed. His mind had the habit of creating stories which made him sadder than he already was. He'd attempt to craft happy endings for the people he saw, but his chronic depression prevented him from being able to see their stories in any other way than sad, like his own life was. his eyes fixed upon the marked parade jacket of the man in front of him. That man, like the man clutching the hand grips of Marvin's chair, was pushing a veteran's wheelchair down the street. Without looking at the people he was passing, Marvin allowed comments and cheers from the crowd to enter his thoughts. He heard, "You men are wonderful," followed by, "God bless America," and "We're so proud of you," along with hundreds of similar cliches and platitudes. He wanted to clap his hands over his ears to drown out their words, but he also wanted to hear them, because during the past 10 years, he'd heard nothing but ridicule and contempt, or worse yet, complete silence about the war from those around him. Of course, a lot of that contempt came from his ex-wife and people who'd known him when he was whole and full of promise. Understandably, those people had grown weary of his alcoholic ways. Over the last couple of years, he'd so shut himself off from the world to focus only on his job that he hadn't noticed when the attitude of the country started to shift. It was dumb luck that Dawn, his boss's niece, had even heard of him. And even greater luck that she'd managed to convince him to come to New York for this parade. The volunteer pushing Marvin's wheelchair leaned forward to ask him something. Marvin caught the end of it when the man said, "Ain't it, Mr. Wineski?" What? Marvin sat up a little straighter and turned his head to better hear the young man over the roaring of the crowd. The man leaned closer and repeated, "I said it's quite the spectacle, ain't it?" Marvin nodded. "Yep. It sure is." His eyes quickly swept the sea of people, and for a moment he felt a lump start to form in his throat. He swallowed hard. The volunteer shouted in his ear, and Marvin jumped. "I hear it's the biggest turnout New York has ever seen for one of these parades." "Is that so?" Marvin raised his eyebrows. The man patted his shoulder. "You should be honored." Those same eyebrows knitted into a frown, but he replied, "I am, son. I am." He hadn't considered himself to be honored since he'd returned from the war, but he had to admit, the man was right. This was quite the spectacle, and he was one of the thousands of Vietnam veterans there that day being cheered by what appeared to be even more thousands of grateful Americans. That lump threatened to return, so Marvin coughed. The man behind him yelled, "Why don't you wave, sir?" Marvin looked down at his mostly useless left hand and then at his healthy right hand. Even though he was being pushed along the left-hand side of the street, he didn't want to garner any more pity or repulsion from the crowd by showing off his left claw, as he called it. So he hesitatingly raised his right hand and waggled his fingers at a little girl they were passing. She smiled and waved enthusiastically at him. He found himself returning her grin with a weak smile of his own. "There you go, Mr. Wineski," the man behind him said as Marvin began to wave vigorously at the little girl, peering back over his left shoulder as best he could until she was no longer visible. Marvin chose another spectator, this time an old woman, and he waved cautiously at her. She nodded in return before shifting her attention to the veterans trailing behind Marvin. There were many men walking behind him, so old women needed to conserve their wave so as not to wear their arms out by the end of the parade, he decided. From there until the Battery, where the parade came to an end, he continued to single out faces that were looking at him from the ranks filling the sidewalks, and he'd wave or nod at each one. Every one of them returned his gesture, and he found himself really warming to the activity, only to learn that the parade route was coming to an end. With that, he slumped over in his chair once more and placed his good hand on top of his left one in his lap. Resignation settled upon him once again, like that heavy quilt which used to pin him to the mattress with its weight when he was a boy staying the night in his grandparents' frigid attic bedroom. He recalled the much-needed warmth it provided, but he also remembered how he felt trapped by that quilt, as if he were suffocating under its heft. He knew that at some point during the night, he'd need to go downstairs to the bathroom, and then he'd have to remove the quilt and face the cold air. The crowd's roar of adulation for him and the other veterans was a warm quilt whose embrace he was about to leave, and all that awaited him was the cold he hadn't been able to escape since his return from Vietnam 12 years ago. He'd come to New York City to find others like himself, other men who had left for the war in one piece, yet returned in pieces. Marvin looked at the other paralyzed or war-wounded veterans being pushed down the parade route in wheelchairs, and he reminded himself that he wasn't alone. Naturally, he already knew this. He spent time with many men just like himself after he was medevaced from the jungle. At least, he still had most of his parts, even if some of them didn't work. He saw many men who weren't so fortunate, including one soldier who had his right arm and leg blown completely off along with his man parts. Yet he survived. Marvin often wondered how that man ended up. Did he have a wife back home who stayed by his side, or had she abandoned him when he came home, literally half the man he was when he left? Marvin knew he viewed things in a jaded light because of Bess, his beautiful bride, who was now married to another man and the mother of that man's children. As the van that would transport him to the post-parade reception came into view, Marvin once again cursed the war that had ruined his life. That is the end of Chapter 1 of Ticker Tape. I do hope you enjoyed it. Again, if you liked it, please look for it on Amazon or any of my other books. I hope you watch my other videos. Visit my website, follow me on Facebook or Instagram, and have a great day.